history without MAS*H. For 11 seasons, this unlikely mix of battlefield tragedy and rapid-fire comedy became one of the most beloved shows ever broadcast, closing out its run with an episode still remembered as the most-watched scripted television event in American history. But long before that famous finale, the show that audiences fell in love with looked very different. Faces came and went. Some actors left in a blaze of headlines. Others slipped away almost silently, with barely a mention. Behind the surgical masks and gallows humor was a revolving door of real people wrestling with fame, frustration, burnout, and the simple desire to be seen as more than a supporting player. This is the story of why they really left. Before MAS*H became appointment television, it was a novel. In 1968, a former army surgeon writing under the pen name Richard Hooker published a darkly comic account of life inside a mobile surgical unit during the Korean War. The book found an audience hungry for stories that mixed humor with horror, and it wasn't long before Hollywood came calling. Robert Altman turned the novel into a film in 1970, a movie so irreverent it practically invented a new tone for war satire, and it landed at the height of anti-Vietnam sentiment in American culture. 2 years later, CBS took a gamble on turning that film into a weekly series. The pairing of writers Larry Gelbart and Gene Reynolds shaped a show that kept the anti-war spirit of the film but slowed things down, letting characters breathe and grow across seasons in a way the 2-hour film never could. Alan Alda took on the role of Hawkeye Pierce, and almost immediately, something interesting happened. The show quietly reorganized itself around him. What started as an ensemble piece began to lean more and more on Alda's chemistry, comic timing, and eventually his voice as a writer and director. That shift, subtle at first, would end up being the quiet engine behind almost every major cast departure that followed. No exit from MAS*H hit harder or landed more unexpectedly than McLean Stevenson's. Stevenson played Lieutenant Colonel Henry Blake, the genially clueless commanding officer whose heart was always bigger than his competence. Audiences adored him. He was funny in a way that felt effortless, and he brought a warmth to the show that balanced out the sharper edges of Hawkeye and Trapper's antics. His work earned him a Golden Globe and made him, for a while, one of the most recognizable faces on the show. But recognition wasn't enough for Stevenson. As the series matured and Alda's role expanded, Stevenson increasingly felt like a supporting piece in someone else's story. He wanted top billing, his own vehicle, a chance to be the reason people tuned in rather than the reliable character actor propping up someone else's arc. At the close of the third season, he told producers he wouldn't be returning. What happened next became one of the most talked about moments in sitcom history. Rather than quietly writing Henry Blake out with a transfer or a convenient retirement, the writers decided to use his exit to remind viewers exactly what kind of show they were watching. In the episode Abyssinia, Blake finally receives his discharge and prepares to head home to his family, and for most of the runtime it plays like a joyful send-off. Then, in the final scene, Radar walks into the operating room and delivers the news that Blake's plane went down over the Sea of Japan, with no survivors. There was no laugh track, no music, just stunned silence. It was one of the first times American television killed off a beloved sitcom character permanently, and it rattled viewers so deeply that the network was flooded with letters, some praising the honesty of the choice, others furious that a character audiences love could simply be taken from them. For Stevenson, the years that followed didn't bring the stardom he had hoped for. His own sitcom vehicles came and went quickly, none finding an audience close to what he'd had on MAS*H. By the early 80s, he admitted in an interview that leaving the show had been a mistake, one he described as taking himself out of the game at the height of something special. He continued working steadily in television until his death in 1996, but he never again found a role that connected with audiences the way Henry Blake had. If Stevenson's departure was loud, Wayne Rogers was almost the opposite. Rogers played Trapper John McIntyre, the wisecracking surgeon whose friendship with Hawkeye defined the show's earliest, loosest years. The two actors had real chemistry on screen, and together they carried much of the show's comic energy in its first 3 seasons. Rogers had signed on believing the show would remain a true ensemble effort, with screen time distributed fairly among the leads. As the series evolved and Alda's character absorbed more of the emotional and narrative weight, Rogers watched his own role shrink into something closer to a sidekick, a friend who mostly reacted to what Hawkeye said rather than driving stories of his own. He later explained that his frustration was never really about ego. It was about watching a character with real potential get flattened into a function. Unlike Stevenson, Rogers didn't stage a dramatic public exit. He simply chose not to renew after the third season. And because his original agreement with the studio had never been formalized into a signed contract, there was little the producers could do to stop him. His disappearance left the writers scrambling to explain Trapper's absence at the start of the next season. And viewers were given no farewell episode, no goodbye scene, nothing resembling the closure Henry Blake had received. It was a jarring way to lose a second major character in as many seasons, and audiences noticed. Rogers eventually stepped away from acting almost entirely, building a second career as a financial commentator and investor, a path that suited his sharp mind far better than sitcom stardom ever had. Despite the abruptness of his exit, there doesn't appear to have been any lasting animosity between him and his former castmates. All spoke warmly of him for decades afterward. Rogers passed away in 2015, remembered as much for his post-Hollywood reinvention as for the role that first made him famous. Few characters were as beloved as Radar O'Reilly, the wide-eyed company clerk who somehow always seemed to know what was happening before anyone told him. Gary Berghoff was the only actor to carry his role over directly from the original film, and he used that head start to build one of the show's most emotionally resonant characters, an innocent caught in the middle of a war he was far too young and far too gentle for. But the sweetness Berghoff brought to Radar masked a harder reality behind the scenes. The demanding production schedule wore on him, compounded by long-standing struggles with anxiety that rarely got discussed publicly in that era. He was also increasingly torn between the show and his family. Being a young father while working the grueling hours the series demanded meant missing much of his daughter's early years, something he later said he regretted for the rest of his life. On top of the emotional toll, there were ongoing disagreements with producers over pay, workload, and how much screen time he was given, disputes that dragged on even as accommodations were made to ease his schedule. By the eighth season, Berghoff had reached his limit. Unlike Rogers, though, his exit was treated with real care. The two-part episode Goodbye, Radar gave the character a send-off worthy of his importance to the show, following him as he returns from leave to find the unit falling apart without him, tries to fix things one last time, and ultimately realizes it's time to go home for good. The final image, Radar walking away alone with his teddy bear left behind on Hawkeye's bunk, remains one of the most quietly devastating moments in the series. After leaving, Berghoff largely withdrew from Hollywood. A short-lived spin-off didn't find an audience, and rather than chase another role, he turned toward painting, wildlife conservation, and even inventing, eventually holding patents related to fishing equipment. He later summarized his decision to leave simply, family and burnout, and a need to put his life back together. It's hard to argue with that kind of honesty. Every ensemble needs someone to root against. And for the first 5 seasons, that role belonged to Major Frank Burns, played with gloriously smug precision by Larry Linville. Burns was petty, rule-obsessed, and secretly having an affair with Major Houlihan, a character built almost entirely to be laughed at and undermined. Linville was so good in the part that it became easy to forget how limited it actually was. That limitation became the problem. As the rest of the cast deepened into fuller, more complicated people, Frank Burns stayed exactly where he started, a one-note punchline in a show that was rapidly outgrowing punchlines. Linville, an actor capable of far more range than the role allowed, recognized that Frank had nowhere left to go. Rather than push for a rewrite or complain publicly, he simply declined to renew his contract at the end of the 5th season, later saying he'd taken the character as far as it could go. His departure ended up reshaping the show in a positive way. With Frank gone, MAS*H no longer needed a cartoonish villain to generate conflict, freeing it to explore more nuanced moral tension instead. Linville continued working steadily in guest roles for years afterward, though he never landed a part as widely remembered as Frank Burns. Off-screen, the character was quietly written out with a convenient promotion, a low-key send-off for an actor who had chosen, on his own terms, to walk away from a role he'd already mastered. Not every notable departure from MAS*H happened mid-series. When David Ogden Stiers arrived as Major Charles Emerson Winchester III to fill the gap left by Linville, he brought something entirely different to the unit, an aristocratic, classically trained surgeon who looked down on Frank Burns had been an easy target. Winchester was a genuine challenge, arrogant but never quite as heartless as he pretended to be. Stiers played the role with a kind of restraint that let Winchester's decency reveal itself slowly over time, layer by layer, until by the series finale he had become one of the show's most quietly moving characters. Rather than leaving early or being written out in dramatic fashion, Stiers stayed through the very last episode, giving Winchester a genuinely poetic finish, a final scene in which he teaches a group of Chinese prisoners of war to play Mozart. It's a small, beautiful moment that captures exactly what made the character work. Someone who insisted he was above it all but was quietly transformed by the same war that broke everyone else. When offered a spot in the short-lived spin-off that followed the original series, Stiers turned it down, explaining that Winchester's story had already reached its natural conclusion. He went on to a long career doing voice work, including for Disney, before publicly coming out later in life, at a time when doing so still carried real professional risk for actors. He passed away in 2018, remembered for both the precision of his performances and the quiet courage it took to be honest about who he was on his own timeline. While much of this story is about actors choosing to leave, it's worth pausing on the one who didn't. Loretta Swit played Major Margaret Houlihan for all 11 seasons, one of only a handful of actors to appear in both the pilot and the finale. She inherited a character introduced almost entirely as a punchline, a nickname more than a person, and spent over a decade slowly rebuilding her into someone audiences respected rather than mocked. By the show's end, Houlihan had become a decorated officer and a skilled head nurse who openly questioned the cruelty of war while still doing her job with total professionalism. Swit has said in interviews that she was determined to make Margaret a woman of substance, and the character's evolution across 11 years stands as proof that she succeeded. In a series defined by actors coming and going, Swit's steady presence gave the show a kind of anchor, proof that not every story on MAS*H had to end in an exit. Looking back across all these exits, a pattern starts to emerge. Almost none of them were really about money, and almost none of them were about actors simply wanting out of a hit show. They were about actors watching their characters shrink while the show's center of gravity shifted toward Hawkeye, and having to decide whether to stay in a diminished role or walk away and risk everything for the chance to be something more. Some, like Stevenson, gambled on stardom and lost. Others, like Berghoff, left to save their own well-being. Others still, like Linville, simply recognized when a character had run its course and had the self-awareness to let it go gracefully. What's remarkable is that despite all this turnover, MAS*H never